Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure, after all the other welcomes, to welcome you to the beginning of our session, which is called Overcoming Adversaries. Tonight, just to give you a sense of how it will work, I'm going to start by asking our two panellists to speak a little bit about who they are and how that brought them to the work they do. And then I'll sort of lead and follow them through a discussion that will range across a whole lot of topics, hopefully a lot of topics that you have in your mind. But don't fear that we're going to leave a lot of time at the end for you to ask your own questions of our two guests. So please keep your questions in mind. And I'm just on a housekeeping note, if you do have a phone or a pager, if you wanted to switch it to silent or off now, that would be lovely. And also tonight's session will finish just around 9 p.m. It's a slightly longer session than these ones normally go. At one stage, I have heard from people involved in this event had been named Talking with the Enemy. Not because of the guests assembled, by any means, but because the idea of talking to or dealing with the other can sometimes feel like that. Tonight I want to ask our panellists to address the idea of the other, both out there, outside this community, and also the other inside our community, the people we don't necessarily see eye to eye with. The question in all of these situations is, how do you deal with the other? How do you live with the other in a society or a nation? And how might you make peace with the other? Our two guests work at the most personal level, face-to-face with others, finding ways to bridge difference. Tonight I hope we will hear how learning about the other at the personal level might influence things at the political level. Firstly, I'd like to invite Rabbi Zalman Kastel to speak about who he is and how that's led him to the work that he's done.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here tonight. Yep. I guess in one way of thinking about myself, I'm a boy from Brooklyn, from Crown Heights. For half of you here, I'm Michaela Kastel's little brother. We grew up in a neighborhood that was half black, half Jewish, and with stories of pogroms. And Easter was the time that the priest in the shtetl would rile the people up to go and bash up Jews and burn things down. And the world was clearly us and them. There was us, the Jews, or the Hasidic Jews in Crown Heights, and then there was that big bad world out there. Arabs, blacks, it was all one big goyim thing that threatened us. I didn't know any better, I didn't know any different. I was in Sydney here in St. Ives on a Tuesday afternoon and got a phone call from a man named Joe Sheridan, the brother of Greg Sheridan. And he wanted to talk to somebody Jewish about where's the compassion, where's all this stuff that he felt was missing in his church. And so rang me out of the blue, came to talk to me at St. Ives, and he talked to me about his frustration with just where the compassion was gone. It was just about ritual and getting through the service. And of course what he was saying resonated with me, because there are a lot of Jewish people that sometimes sit in the shul and wonder what it's all about. But what was surprising for me with Joe was that I had never actually had a conversation with someone outside my own faith about the things that matter most, the things that matter at the spirit, soul level. So here I was, a Hasidic boy from Brooklyn, listening to this Christian man who was so altruistic, so filled with concern about doing God's will on earth in a compassionate sense. And it moved me greatly. And so, being a good Chabadnik, I thought this is an opportunity to save the world and teach them all about goodness and kindness. Mitch Fifield is on record ridiculing the Howard government for giving a grant to these crazy people who are going to teach the world about goodness and kindness. Do we really need to be telling people about goodness and kindness? This is what he said in the Parliament about a dozen years ago. I haven't forgiven him. Yeah. And so we decided we're going to do this, but at the time I thought that it would make it a little bit more interesting if we can get a Muslim along. This is after 9/11, and we thought, why don't we bring a Muslim and a Christian, let's talk about shared values. And so we went to St. Ives North in May 2002 to talk about shared values, to talk about how we can work together to make the world a better place. And then we went to a Muslim school the Muslim school we went to was called Arcana College in Kingsgrove. I was concerned about going to a Muslim school because there are Arabs there often. And I didn't want to, I mean, I believed in this whole thing, but I wasn't prepared to die for it. So I took off this sort of giveaway, put this on. Then I took my glasses off to look more Muslim. I didn't know that at the time. Right. I went into the school quite apprehensive of what I was going to find there. And what I found actually was a group of children with shining eyes who were so excited about zakat and making God happy and doing good deeds and making the world a better place. And it absolutely floored me. And what I learned a short time after that was it wasn't just about goodness and kindness, it's actually about seeing the other as a human being and about overcoming the prejudices, whatever prejudices we have, to actually see other people, regardless of their faith, regardless of what some people did in the name of that religion, regardless of history, to seeing them as human beings. And that realization has animated me and has given my life purpose for the last 12 years. And I'd like to share some of that with you tonight.
Professor Dan Avnon, about what's led him to the work that he does and his background.
Thank you. Thank you for all of you coming around and introducing me so generously. Before I say some things about myself, I want to thank Sir Zelman Cowan University Fund for hosting me, and the trustees, Michaela Kalowski and Johnson Stone, and all the rest who are responsible for this magnificent venture, and of course Sue Friedman-Levy, who runs it. In the end, she gets the telephones, right? I want to say something. I didn't know much about this foundation before I was privileged to get a fellowship from it. And I want to say something about these two men, Zelman Cohen and John Hammond, about whom I heard today. And then I read about them. I was really touched when I read the history, the biography of this man. And just one thing to say about the two of them, which resonates with this evening, is that both men knew exactly who they were. They lived themselves as they were. One an intellectual, a public figure, and a politician, the leader he was here, and the other a businessman who established what he did. And both of them, at a certain point in their lives, once they understood the wealth and the honors of this world, decided to give back to their communities. And in that respect, there's a very fine, both men, both human beings, there's a very fine combination of being who you are and being part of the larger world. And I think that this fellowship exemplifies that, and it's very touching to be privileged in this way. Now, I also want to thank, of course, the Australian Friends of the Hebrew University, and Barry Joseph, who runs a very tight but very open ship, and the Shalom College, Dina Kaufman and Michael Mizrahi, who are the two people who I met. Michael got this going and put all this together. I want to thank you for your hospitality. Now, a few words about myself. That's what I was supposed to do, right? I've been off, but this is really important for me. I'm really grateful. Okay, so what I'll say, you already got a sneak preview from my mother was born in Haifa, and when you stop there for a minute, I also was thinking, she was born in Palestine, right? Because it was 1923 and the Brits already had the mandate, so that was Palestine. But her father was born in 1900. Where was he born? He was born in the Ottoman Empire. And his father was born, he was born in Haifa too, and his father was born in Jerusalem. No, his mother was born in Jerusalem, and her father was born in Sfat, in the Galilee. So I come, and they were a Hasidic family. My grandfather was still a rabbi. And then, things happened. And yeah, I was talking. Right. And then there's, sorry, it ended up being me, right? But in Israeli, that's my mother's side. My father's side, he was born in Lithuania. He and his brother were Zionists who came to Palestine. before the war in 1937. His family stayed there. My grandfather, my grandmother, aunt, and they perished in the Holocaust. My father joined after doing military stuff, getting the world together and establishing the state and all that. He became a diplomat. So that's how I ended up being born in Sweden and raised. Yes, you come places. Where are you born? So you say Sweden. All right, now people's minds. I was a Viking, but not anymore. so that was just some kind of coincidence. But I was raised formative years in Sierra Leone. He was a diplomat, and I was for 4 years in Sierra Leone. That's a formative experience. Very interesting that what you said about yourself. There's something all of us know, or not, that our childhood does it to you later on. You don't know when you're a child. So I was the only white kid in the class, and I remember I'm competitive, and I remember that I can give you exactly the kid was. I don't know if he was smarter than me, right? But he got better grades. I know. I see him. He always consistently. There was this thing called 11 plus. And they rank you nationally. He was ahead of me. And there was this other guy who ran faster than me. I remember him. So yeah. Now I didn't realize at the time. So I know that there's this black kid who's smarter than me, and there's this other guy who's faster than me. Now, you don't know that as a child, but and later on you wonder why you're doing what you're doing. So part of that is that. So this is just a childhood experience, has to do with your biography. Later on, things happened, and when I came back, as you mentioned, when I came back to the United States, I started looking at the Israeli regime and stuff. I was asked to do so. And I came to the conclusion that we lack a shared civic language. And I came to that by being a consultant to the Israeli parliament. In the Constitutional Committee, there were judges and there were politicians and academics, and they were each talking his own specialty, his specialization, and there wasn't a shared language. One wants to constitute rights, and the other guy wants to have a democracy, and the third wants to have patriotic education, and they're not talking, and this is just formally. Why is that so? Because we don't have a shared common civic language. How do you do that? Through education. So I set aside some of my academic stuff, and for 10 years I dealt with that, using the Hebrew University and our knowledge that we could accumulate at the Hebrew University, translate that research, teaching, curriculum, and we actually set up a small school on campus where we could work out the curriculum, trying to create from childhood a language that would be understood by Jews, by non-Jews, by religious, by non-religious. That's what we did there. And that's what I did until 2 or 3 years ago, and I'm still thinking about it. And part of thinking about it is being here, because in Australia there's a lot to be learned, and we may say something about that later. So thank you all for coming and for hosting me so good.
So I want to jump right in and do something almost a little bit definitional, but it's deceiving because it's not simple, it's multi-layered. When we talk about the other out there, who are we talking about? What do we mean in the word the other? And it'd be wonderful to hear different perspectives as well.
I'll do it quick, and then you go, and then we'll see. This is a dialogue, right? We didn't pre-script this. It's very simple. For me, the real challenge with the other is the other in my mind. Most of us look at the other outside there, but the preconception is usually the thing that is between me and you, because you're a woman, and because you look in a certain way, you remind me of someone, and I don't see you. I see the memory. I see the something that I'm attracted to, or I'm afraid of, or I'm concerned about. So first of all, the other is in me, in that respect. Not that I am that person. And that is how I begin looking at otherness. That's before all of the stuff that we all know, that person is very different and he's scary or she's intimidating or attractive. So that is for me the other. The other is the category in my mind that I'm not aware, causes me to look at you and not see you.
Wow. Yeah, it's a beautiful way of thinking about it that I've never considered before.
Neither did I. You get a straight question. That's actually you can.
Yeah, I think that other. I mean, there's the other in our mind, but we're I guess social beings, and so there's the other in our mind, but there's also those other layers that construct that other in our mind, and that's the other we read about or the other we hear about. But as you say, those all those associations. There's one of my boss, actually, one of my board members is a black man, and his name is Mohammed Dukali from Liberia. And when I first met him, I didn't have the experience of a black kid being faster than me and smarter than me. And I guess it was part of my old sort of Brooklyn experience prejudices probably came in. And I looked at him and I didn't think much of him. And I also thought he was a kid. He looked quite young. I think he's about my age. Considering my son is 18 now, I think, yeah, so grown up a little bit. And you know, when I got to actually know him really, the depth, that beauty. So I mean, I think when I think of other, I guess there's an outside layer that covers something that is vast and beautiful and complex, rather than that that little picture I have in my mind that prevents me from seeing. I guess when I think of other, I think of that opportunity, that other that I haven't yet discovered, and it's an adventure. And when you can actually connect through that, when I sort of, even on Facebook, just looking at chatter and things, and when they're going through, some of my Muslim friends are going through a whole controversy about moon sightings and when Ramadan should begin and end. And for me, that's the Talmud. It's coming back to me, all the same arguments from 2,000 years ago that were quite intense then, and that very intense now, just in another context.
You both spoke about how you experience the other in different ways, in your mind or with excitement, with anticipation of someone new. But when we feel like we're being treated like the other, how does it affect how we behave?
Well, this is something that is actually what I do. I examine that most of my life. Let's say this thing about otherness, right? So in Israel, we're a small country, as most of you know, most probably been there, and we're very diverse. As Jews and as non-Jews, there's a great diversity. And the way I go about my life is going to the places that I know least, and sometimes I'm a bit intimidated by. I go to the edges of society, I go to the edges of personality where they're normal, but just different. And I try to understand, it's just, this is part of me, this is the life I live. To understand human beings, to understand humanity, because that's how I understand myself. If I get to know myself better, then I know the world better, and I think it does good. It feels good, it feels right. So for me, when I encounter on a personal or institutional level, that look that I know so well, because it's so prevalent, when I'm not seen, I'm not there. I'm Professor Avnon, the Israeli Jew from Israel. Which of course I am. But I'm also here, it's also, I'm also here. When I see that someone with me is not looking at me, but is waiting for the minute to pounce through his frame or her frame, that's when things become interesting. Okay, so that's what I can say about it. So even when I'm in Australia, I've been traveling a lot outside Sydney to feel what it is to be outside. I feel familiar and comfortable in an urban environment. How it is when I'm not here. I get a better sense of how Sydney became Sydney by understanding what's not Sydney. You go to the edges and then you come back in. And it's the same with people. That's how I go about the other thing. And it's the same, of course, we'll go to that point with Arab, Palestinian colleagues, friends, adversaries, people I can't stand and people I love. That's, I go there. I'm not afraid.
Yeah, I mean, I remember very distinctly something you're talking about, but actually in a very different context. I was at the yeshiva here in Flood Street in Bondi, and there were a bunch of us enthusiastic 20-year-olds from New York who thought we were going to change the world. And the office staff used to get sick of us because we want this and we would want that. And we didn't exist. We were just a bocher, another bocher. I walk into the office and I thought I was asking for something very reasonable, and this look of disdain and disgust sort of comes over the secretary's face, and I don't exist. I'm just a bocher.
You look like that.
That's how it looks. I was thinking actually, I've got a black hat, and I was thinking of bringing it tonight to play with that sort of image of what it means. But I guess just to stand in someone else's shoes for a moment, recently we had a group of Muslims running down the street in the CBD, screaming in Arabic. It was quite a horrific scene. I know from an educator, a consultant that normally advises teachers about how to teach about different societies and cultures, and she happened to be walking down the street in the city when this whole group of angry men shouting in Arabic went screaming through the city, and she was horrified. Just after that, Mike Carlton wrote in the paper, it used to be that there was a small group of people that used to say, you Muslims go back to your own country. Thanks to these people running through our streets, the whole country feels that way. After that, it was a pretty harsh thing to say, and I spoke to one of the leaders of the Muslim community subsequent to that, and I said, what do you think about what Mike Carlton said? And she said, she thinks he's spot on. What he said is actually, she thinks it's a good assessment of the way people feel, the sentiment of people here. And then she said something really interesting. She said that when these kind of things happen, it makes it very difficult to have those internal arguments about what to do, because there's such a strong opposition, such a fierce, generalized criticism of the community that you can't be self-critical, because then you're just sounding like our enemies. This is an interesting perspective that she had, but that sometimes when you're seen as the other, you just circle the wagons and you just go stronger and you just dig in. So I think that element there of digging in, closing off conversation can happen when I feel or someone feels like they're being seen as the other.
We're talking about seeing and perception, but I also want to talk to you both, before we get into hearing some stories about the work you've both done, both in Israel and Australia, about the language we use, or maybe the lack of language we have. And I wonder, how does the language we use when we talk about the other, whoever that is, in the public space, shape our relationship with them?
Good question. I'll say this. As I told you, it's immodest. The immodest goal that I took upon myself in 2001 at Hebrew University, and I said it. I want a shared civic language. And what is a shared civic language? My assumption is it doesn't exist, which means we hear the same words, but we respond differently, different interpretations. It sounds the same. That's what I saw in the Knesset. That's what I saw in our parliament. Educated, sit in the same room. It's not only politics, it's language, like rights, for example, right? In Hebrew, the word rights, if you're Orthodox in Israel, and if you're liberal in Israel, and if you're socialist in Israel, if you're all sorts of stuff in Israel, somebody stands there, a professor who knows what he's talking about, talks about rights and constitution, and Harris stand there, I take the guy, why are you so upset about it? I mean, beyond your politics. He says the Hebrew word for constitution. What are these guys doing? Anybody here know a bit of Hebrew? There's a word, chukah. In Hebrew, the word for constitution, chosen by the Zionist movement, is the word that in the Bible speaks about the eternity of God's law. What's the matter with you, Zionists? You're taking our language, the eternity, the holy, and you're legislating it as if it's your word, it's as if your constitution. You are the guy who's going to fix things forever using chukah, right? This is an answer to the question. So how do you start working with that? The Hebrew language is apparently the same, but different interpretations. And you've got an Arab minority, and you've got all the time immigrants coming in, Jewish, but coming from other languages. So if I have another minute, I will say what I thought to do about it, what we did about it. So I say, all right, gotta relax, gotta not be a professor, right? Yeah, this is Australia. I love I love this in Australia. Like, it's all right, no worries. We can solve this tomorrow. There's no issue. Like in Israel, if we don't solve it now, then the governments, go to pieces. In Australia, it's all right. It'll be next year, and I love that. So in Israel, it's not like that. That urgency got to get done. And how to do? Let's go through perception, not through cognition. We say, don't be a professor. Don't get them to study what a constitution is and how it was in America and in France and maybe in Australia. Let them feel what it is to be in relationship. And then understand the question of boundaries, because constitutions create boundaries. And then at the end of the learning process, let's give it a word. It could be the word that but we understand the word, we felt it. So I had Arabs and Jewish fellowships by associations like the Friends here. Someone funded it. Our Arab students sat in a room, spoke Arabic for a year. And I asked them to create a dictionary. When you hear equality, what do you hear? In Hebrew, the Hebrew word for equality. When you hear constitution, what do you hear? Give me all the words. What do you hear? Not what I teach you. And the same religious. We got the Orthodox. When you hear these words, what do you hear? I can tell you, it's amazing, because what you hear, not what I teach. An Arab hears equality. Arab, Israeli, Palestinian hears equality. He's enraged. He's enraged. Because he's second guessing, right? Because he's not seeing, he's saying, you guys want me, you're going to teach me equality when I'm experiencing inequality? And the Orthodox Jew says, you're teaching me rights? What's going on? What's the basis of the human being that you're talking about? And they're so upset by the language of liberal democracy. And so that's what, I won't go on with that, but and this happens in real rooms, real people, and they have to file in reports and write stuff, and I read all of this, and I get very excited. Intellectually, it's a great experience, and civically, it's a huge challenge to figure out how to get an entire system go through this kind of process, understanding that I have that language, you have your language, and now we have to have the third one together. How do you do it? Well, that's what I can still talk about later, but
we'll come back to that.
That's a challenge. Yeah. Fascinating. I'm learning so much. One of the things in terms of language, that in terms of faith, is there are different ways of talking about experience, and I think some of my Dati friends in Israel sound like they can use a lesson in that. There's often language of right and wrong, of either right or wrong, or complete relativist positions. So it could be that very cold intellectual, the Jews think this and the Muslims do that and the Buddhists do this, and it's all a bunch of archaeological little objects almost, sort of big things. Or you have the language of persuasion, of arguing that I'm right and you're wrong, and let me explain to you why. And then there's the language of sharing, and the language where we talk and in a way that just doesn't seek to persuade, doesn't seek to convince anyone of the merit of the way I do it, but still talking with great enthusiasm and passion and joy, and commitment or sanctity, sacred language, as it were, where we talk about ourselves without apology. Without trying to justify or to make the other person feel comfortable, to be ourselves fully. I mean, that's one thing about language. Another one is also about the way that language can exclude. Brendan Nelson famously said that if the Muslims don't want to keep our values, they can clear off. I was at a Muslim school the next day at Lakemba, at Risalah College. That school became famous for other reasons, which I'm not going to get into. But anyway, there's a young teacher there named Ulla Issa, and she was outraged by this. And part of it was about this idea of misunderstanding language when we're talking about values. And if we actually go under the words and to the meaning, things like mateship, talking about the Anzacs, and there was an older man who said to Scott Morrison at the event at the City Institute from Bangladesh, he said, I can't relate to the Anzacs, that whole legend's got nothing to do with me. But if we can actually just peel off the words of the patriotic, what's it about? It's about loyalty. It's about sacrifice. It's about commitment. So it's again, as you say, it is about being able to interrogate the language and find what's behind that language. And I think there's much more common ground once we do that. One more example of that is freedom. There are a lot of very religious people, including religious Muslims, who might hear the word freedom and not be too attracted to that because they think freedom, and they think freedom to be decadent and to indulge yourself and whatever. But freedom also means to be free to actually practice your faith without persecution. And that freedom is, of course, very important to religious people. So again, it's about, I'm not so clear about which language, but more about how we use language.
I wanted to maybe get some sort of practical sense of how all these ideas have sort of filtered down into your work. Professor Avnon, you tried to change the educational system from within, and I want to know what the challenges were for you.
We have time.
We have a week, right?
We have time. I can tell you the challenges. Well, first of all, any person in the 21st century knows that trying to change the system from within and talking public service is not something that most of us don't take unless you really, you really want to do it. The point was to create, it was very simple. The business people here will understand it. I'll tell you this story. The donor, the center I established and then we established was called the Gilo Center. Gilo is a very generous philanthropist, an Israeli-American, who said, look, I don't trust universities. You give them money, they take 20%, they don't know what to do with the other 80%. I never gave a penny to a university, and why should I give to you? I said, give me a milestone. And that's how people understand. He said, all right, milestone, change, take the civics curriculum in the schools and make it mandatory in all the school systems, double the number of hours everybody's studying, put in the ideas that you want me to fund, and you take 5 years and do it. I would say, Barry, that's a donor for you. Right? And I, since I had a plan, I said immediately, yes, immediately. And we got, because I knew it was necessary. I knew it was necessary. I mean, when you know it's right, the right, wrong thing, this is simple, right, practical. It took 2 years to get through this terribly difficult years, but 2 years to get the politics and the administration to double the number of hours in school. We had to wait for a government that was a labor government to get it done, and commitment. I left the Gilo Center the day that the government committed 700 million, a lot of money to get this through the years, down the path, which was doubling and enabling. Now, to work in the system, that was easy compared to the fact that you have to create curriculum. More importantly, you need teachers. And you need receptivity. So what we did, very simple. We set up an MA program with scholarships for teachers in civics who didn't have a background. We created a civics program, MA in civics. Teachers came and studied. We created this experiment like I told you about high schools. We had kids coming in, teaching a program. We're teaching curriculum that we, the scholars, were developing with teachers on the side. And then we had a whole series of events based on human interaction. Every program, this was something I don't budge. A kid, a teacher, a scholar, anyone, you get into a bus and you go down to that place you're talking about. That place could be a person, that place could be a site. Let's say you're against poverty, go and be with the poor. If you think you want to bring peace to the Middle East tomorrow morning, okay, let's go to where it's difficult. Let's go to a zone of conflict and then come back and think about it. Does it going to happen in 5 minutes? If you want to settle anything, I don't care about your ideas. I don't care what values you're going to promote. I care that there's perception that then goes to cognition, rather than the other way around. Usually universities, they teach you theories and then go to the world and do something about it. In this respect, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. If you don't feel the human need, you don't get the human mind on these issues. And then you get in that one bus And I have a million stories about that. Arabs and Jews and Orthodox and right-wing. I had one cohort where we had the prime ideologue of the settler movement in the West Bank, and we had the parliamentary assistant of a guy called Azmi Bshara, a member of parliament, extremist, who ran away from Israel. He's an Al Jazeera commentator today. And he can't come back to Israel because he did things he shouldn't have done. They were in the same bus for 2 years. And this guy remained a settler, and she remained a Palestinian nationalist, and everyone around them were in between, right? But they were there. They saw suffering, right? They felt the suffering together. The Palestinians suffer, the Jews suffer, everybody's suffering. It helps you understand, and it helps you understand what it is you're doing. And so we did a complex work. And the simple thing was simply just to double the number of civic hours, and let's put in a good, interesting civics curriculum, the system, which we did.
Rabbi Kastel, in your work, you go into schools in New South Wales and Queensland through this foundation called Together for Humanity, and I wonder, when did you get the idea that that was the way to do it? What was it that you wanted to drum up or start in those classrooms?
Yes, as I said in my introduction, it started as really as something to bring the values back into society. Remember, this is in 2002, before Brendan Nelson's Simpson's Donkey and all the rest of that. At the time, I spoke to a senior person in the New South Wales Education Department about values, and he said, we don't talk about values. Values are implicit. We don't do that. The values, but it's changed, of course. Values now is very explicit in our curriculum. So it started off about values, but just going back to compassion, all that. But more that I, as you say, sat on the same bus and actually interacted with people, I changed, and I realized the magic of it in me. Sitting in my car one day, listening on the radio, I don't know if it was Alan Jones or whoever it was, going off about how terrible it was that in Auburn they've got this swimming pool, and the women use it separate to the men, and this is a terrible thing that would be the end of Australia. And I thought, I'm a Chabadnik, I can relate to that. But the other thing that happened for me when I listened to this thing on the radio was I could actually see behind the argument. It wasn't about a swimming pool, and it wasn't about who uses it at what time. This is about the invasion of the other into our space. And I felt angry about that. And when I noticed that in myself, I realized that I had changed. That what I had set out to do, to learn, or to teach, was something different to what I had learned, and what I was now obligated to teach, what I was called to do. So that's been part of my journey. Sorry, I forgot your question.
I think my question was, firstly, that I wanted to hear you talk more. We want to hear you talk a bit more about the actual work that Together for Humanity does. But it's one thing, we heard Professor Avnon talk about the way that he thought, I'm going to change civic education, I'm going to work within the system, I'm going to train teachers, I'm going to do it from perception and then cognition. And with you, it wouldn't necessarily seem natural that you, in your case, a rabbi, a Muslim sheikh, indigenous elders in Australia, that you would get these people together and take them into classrooms and kind of confront young people with each other. And I wondered where that idea came from. It's sort of simple, but it's incredibly complex at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it just I like the professor's saying. I've experienced it before I understood it. In some ways, it was very much an outgrowth of the Chabad way of thinking, which really draws on deeper Jewish roots. Jews, in terms of our tradition, are very much inclined to do what you're talking about. You see a problem, you know what's right, and you just are determined to make it right. We don't easily accept impossible, or this is the way it is, and therefore it needs to remain that way. So looking at this world that we're in, and thinking about this incredible, and I found it fascinating to talk. We did some surveys of students' attitudes. It was developed by Dr. Rivka Wittenberg from the Australian Catholic University in Victoria, where we asked kids to just tick boxes to see what associations they make with certain labels. So what do they think about Anglo-Australians? What do they think about Jews? What do they think about Muslims, Asians, Aboriginal people? And one of the things that I found staggering was that the insularity of some children in the upper North Shore was no different to a kid in Crown Heights, the most religious, and these were kids mostly atheists. Who knows where they're coming from? I don't know, but it's not the Bible Belt in the Hills District. These are sort of kids in the North Shore, and they had the same attitudes, assumptions in terms of their own group, all positive, where they're kind and they're tolerant and they're friendly and they've got good values, and all of the positive about their own group. And Asians, Muslims, Jews, not Aboriginals. In fact, it's funny that Aboriginals were some kind of noble savage, and they thought they were really cute, and they had didgeridoos. They had no problem with Aboriginals. Not there. In Alice Springs, a different story. But so you have these assumptions about your own group, and we've seen this with Jewish kids about Jews. We've seen this with Muslim kids about Muslims. Again, the same. And in fact, one of the really interesting things we saw from Muslim kids is assumptions about Jews being not respecting women, which is, from a Jewish perspective, read out the paper. But I mean, it's come really from experience, mostly from just interacting with the other and having my own eyes open. But then also, an Aboriginal elder, her name is Heather Lawton, had a big influence on us, and she said, "Our mob need this," and that's coming back to the way that people begin to think of themselves. People take on the prejudices. I'll never forget this little Arabic boy from Chester Hill, and this is after the Cronulla riots, and we're talking about perceptions. And I said to him, what do people think about Bulldog supporters? And we're trying to give this idea about, your perception doesn't necessarily match reality. And they said, oh, everybody thinks Bulldog supporters are wild and crazy. I said to this group of kids, almost all Arabic, what do people think? What do you think about Bulldog supporters? Because they're all supporters of the Bulldogs in that area. And all the kids except for one said, oh, we're just people like everybody else. But this one boy said, no, it's true. Bulldog supporters are very violent. And I said, okay, that's interesting. It's not my script, but all right, let's go, let's see what happens. And why do you think that? He said, because I'm a Bulldog supporter and I'm violent. Okay. Why do you think that? He said, I'm Arab, and Arab people are violent. He completely accepted that story. And look, it's not just about outside prejudice, there's also the gangs, the Arabic gangs. And so there's a perception of what he hears on TV, is what his older brother or uncle or whoever it is that it wants to be in a gang. There's a gang mentality. And these two things have come together in this child's mind and became reality. And what Heather was saying to us from an Aboriginal perspective is that choice is so important. And so we began to work with children from minority groups, Pacific Islanders, Arabic kids, and Aboriginal kids, helping them change their perception about themselves and their own choices about what they can do with their life.
I wanted to find out as well what sort of opposition you both receive to the work that you do, and what corners it comes from, and whether that surprised you.
Well, first of all, usually I want to be practical. First of all, opposition. You get, when you work against the grain, everyone here knows, and you get opposition right, where the grain is moving. So within the university, for example, the surprising answer has nothing to do with values. Should universities do this kind of stuff? It's a good question. It's not a trivial question. It's a question of responsibility. You have to have a philosophy, a way of life. You have to understand what it is to make use of your institution. It's true for a businessman, it's true for an academic, it's true for an administrator, true for everyone. How do I make use of the position in my life, especially if I'm a bit privileged, in order to do something good in this world? Opposition begins there, because of course I set aside some of my research to do this. And I'm being paid to do research. So is this all right? Well, of course, there was a research element. So this is a surprising part of it, maybe not the answer you expected. Then there's all the bureaucratic stuff. I won't go into it because that's really way beyond 9 p.m. Then the whole thing working with ministries and parliaments and, as I told you, I was a Viking at that point. All of it, that took away a lot from me. And then, yes, there's the political thing, because something so simple that in countries like, now I'm learning Australia, but I know the United States and Canada pretty well, and Canada was for me a source of inspiration for the things I did. But all the time people said, go to Australia, right? So when I come out of here, other things will happen. And why am I mentioning those two places? It's very clear. In immigration countries, but they're not Jewish immigration, the same people coming to something. They don't come from everywhere. It's clear that once you're here, there's something common that either you accept or something not good is going to happen. This is how we are, the commonwealth. In Israel, it's different. And there, the opposition, it turned out that this simple thing was interpreted as some kind of left-wing, progressive, anarchic, do you say? Radical, to create a shared civic language, which, for a parliamentary liberal democracy, that's all, it's the regime. Well, that isn't, because, we're not only democratic, we're also Jewish. And Jewish could mean all sorts of stuff. I deal with that in my other work, we're not talking about that today. And in the end, the difficulty was, we were really successful, we got brilliant people doing the job, students I mean, who later went back into the system, and one of them was appointed the civics commissioner. I had nothing to do with it, just based on merit. But when you're political, there must be a conspiracy going on, right? So this guy went in, all of the civics teachers in Israel loved him, the Arabs, the right wing, the left wing. He's a professional. He did the job. He taught them how to be inspiring, interesting, things like you were telling us, a million. He knew how to get teachers sitting in a room to talk to one another and not changing their identity, just doing something right together. But he was attacked for 2 years. There was a campaign against him. While the system was changing, he was still leading the system, but all the time like this, politicians and this and that, and in the end, he was forced to resign. As I told you on the phone, for a year and a half, there wasn't a civics commissioner in the ministry. They simply couldn't get anyone else to do someone good enough to, and I'm very proud to say that a woman was appointed a month ago. He was the graduate of our first cohort. Cowan is his name. And now Yael Guron, a woman who was appointed to the same position, our second cohort. So that's a sense, an educator's sense of satisfaction. But it goes against the grain, because in Israel we have a real values issue. In Israel we do not share. We're now in a deep shared value crisis in our society. And then this is interpreted along those lines, right? If you're teaching liberal parliamentary democracy something important, does that mean that you're not teaching national Jewish tradition as the basic value of our country? These are important issues that are being debated. And from there, the opposition, the fears, drive the opposition to the stuff that we've been doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think you might be seeing Australia in a slightly more positive light than we actually are. I've been engaged with the process of the Australian curriculum in terms of trying to see some rigor. And I listened to you talk about doubling the amount of time available for civics. That's not going to happen in Australia. And civics here has a whole stack of things that they need to get through that's crammed into it. People in the curriculum authority talked about civics as sort of a mop-up. All the stuff that they didn't deal with anywhere else is going to be rangehacht in a very big Shalom. Civics. And now there is a real pushback against there's the three priorities in the Australian curriculum, reconciliation. There's some real pushback, and talking to parliamentarians of the ruling party, there is some real concern about what this all means. And as one senator said to me, I don't want my child to be confronted at school with questions about culture and to understand their own culture, because they don't want to examine this. What's it going to do? So, I mean, you're talking about from a Jewish point of view, and of course we Jews have just a great big passion about all this, but Australia, it's almost, starting to talk about this is scary for a lot of people. And I think, from a Jewish perspective, as people who have been on the receiving end of a lot of prejudice, it's something we shouldn't sit on our hands and watch this unfold and roll away, because it might be too late. Now there's a review of the curriculum, and it's something we really need to be concerned about.
There's been a lot of debates in this country at the moment, or in the last few years, about free speech and hate speech. It was in the news again today. And one of the ideas that we've had in Australia for a long time is this idea of multiculturalism. And I wonder, I would love to hear from you both quickly on whether you think it's an idea that embodies something that keeps us going, or whether it's an idea that sort of had its day.
Yeah, the short answer from my point of view is that it's an idea that is still valuable in Australia. As you were saying, the question, language is just a sign that points to something. I think in the Australian context, multiculturalism still means some very good things. It means about acceptance of difference. In the UK, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs has come to the conclusion that multiculturalism is no longer working. I don't think that multiculturalism in Australia is the same as in the UK, but certainly there are problems with multiculturalism. I don't think multiculturalism deserves a free pass, and it's a wonderful word. I think there's a very big, the scales are heavily weighted on both sides. Multiculturalism, I think, has emboldened some separatists and people who think that we don't need a shared language and you don't need to be Australian, and there's nothing valuable or beautiful or wonderful about Australia. So I think there was a time where multiculturalism did mean be separate, be different. Any culture is wonderful as long as it's not white and British. And that's obviously not a useful thing at all. But I think the silence, Morris Yema as Premier, I don't think he ever uttered the words multicultural or multiculturalism when he was Premier. And I think that was a worrying sign about where we're going and the kind of signals, the code of whether it's free season, whether it's now time to kick the Muslim or the other. The things are changing, and I think multicultural is probably a word still worth fighting for.
Well, what happened, as I told, I was inspired by the Canadian experience and have a ministry for multiculturalism, and I learned a lot from the Canadian experience of the British and others. But what happens with words when they migrate across cultures is that they bring with them baggage that is sometimes unintended. I don't know what in Israel someone thinks when he hears multiculturalism. And if they've heard the word, then they're concerned that multiculturalism may mean the end of the Jewish state. Israel is the state of the Jewish people. That's a privileged status of the Jewish people. There's a Jewish culture. We're Jews, so we argue. If there are Jews in this room, then you would know, Jews always have a lot of opinions about what anything means. So in Israel, what is a Jewish state? Another evening. It is. But still, when you hear multiculturalism, so at the end of the issue of the Jewish state, and now we're going to be a multicultural state, that's what happens when a word migrates. And I think it's a valid concern. So in the work that we did, let's say in the final thing that we did at the Gilel Center, we had a class that was about pluriculturalism. And I used the word plurality. The whole point being, let's set aside. Just notice that there's a plurality of cultures within the Jewish communities, among Jewish communities. Let's, first of all, in Israel we really need that. Let's recognize plurality, and from plurality move on to see what makes us have a shared civic space. And I don't use the word multiculturalism because people are ignorant, and then they use multiculturalism according to what they read somewhere, sometime, and usually either they very fervently like or very fervently dislike, and it's not complex enough for me. So I just don't use it. Use pluricultural.
I'm wondering about the political impact of the work you both do. We don't have enough time for me to say what are the goals of the work you both do, although it'd be good if you could touch on it a bit. But I wonder, how does engaging on a personal level, the way you've both spoken about, change the political? Does it filter up or down? What's the direction of how we change people's views on issues around racism or discrimination?
It is, because of the nature of the work I do, I've spent a fair bit of time in Canberra talking to politicians, and they're obviously, like anybody else, in whatever your job is, you're interested in getting ahead and just keeping your position. And I had a very interesting conversation with now a cabinet member about these questions about multiculturalism, what these different words mean. And he said to me, I want to make sure that I bring my constituents with me. And if I use the word multiculturalism to my constituents, what they hear is privileging or celebrating every culture except for our own. So, I mean, I think when people look at politicians, and I ask kids a lot of times, whose responsibility is it for us to have an inclusive society? And a lot of kids say it's the government's responsibility. But of course, government will only do what government thinks is in their interest. So ultimately, it is about changing the perspectives of voters.
Well, in a nutshell, this really is broader than Israel. Maybe I don't know about Australia. My sense of traveling in the world and being in all sorts of places is that something has happened to what we call the political sphere. Politics, political systems, governments are a bit more distant from everyday experience in relation to what I read in history had been in the past. And change today happens, that's my experience, or at least that's my belief, at least that's how I live. Grassroots, simple, which means in Israel, I've studied this intensely. When you want to change something radical, doesn't matter what, right wing, left wing, doesn't matter. It starts with the NGOs, and then from the NGOs it goes up to social organizations, and then social organizations figure out in the political system who's the point, that if I press that politics, if it's a political party, if it's then things change. Things change today in democratic world, the profound changes, the ones that have to do with everyday life. I'm not talking about sending airplanes to the sea in Antarctica, but if you want to change education in your neighborhood, if you want to have a better life in whatever, it starts from bottom up, and that is a change underway in the democratic world, much stronger than in the past because governments are unwieldy, states are not functioning. That's how I see it. That's why all of the work that I've done in this field emphasizes all the time your responsibility, and then do the politics if you want to, second stage. But first, change yourself and your surroundings.
I'm conscious of the time, and I would like to invite some questions from the floor now. Before I do that, quickly though, one thing if you can, firstly try and ask questions, not make statements, and try and give us your questions in one breath so we can get as many as we can. There's a question over here in the front row.
Yes, to Professor Avnon. I wonder if what you've been saying tonight is about civics. Is the answer to the question that has puzzled a number of your supporters in relation to current controversies with Professor Lynch. Was your approach to Professor Lynch an exercise in civics, or was it a misjudgment?
Shall we answer what I want or pick up? I can.
Yeah.
I don't know what you mean my approach to it.
Yeah, sorry, could you...
You're looking for a reference, which seems to many of us a puzzling thing for you.
Oh no, that's a framing issue. That's Professor Lynch's way of dealing with the media. Very simple. Like many exchange programs, all exchange programs have a protocol. Any scholar here, anybody here who's a professor or a student knows that if you apply for a fellowship or research grant, then, and it's an exchange one, then you need a partner in the other institution. If you're a student, you need a mentor. If you're a professional, you need a colleague. The Sir Zelman Cowan fellowship offers visits on from Sydney to Jerusalem, Jerusalem to Sydney, and you are requested to contact potential colleagues at the host institution.
Your advisors must have told you about Professor Lynch.
Nobody advised me. No, I'm a free person, no advisors in that sense. This is very simple. You open the website at the University of Sydney, which is what I did, and I perused all of the Sydney faculty. I contacted 5 who deal with, I knew nothing about any, I apologize, I didn't know anyone in Australia. I simply took those 5 names of people at the University of Sydney who deal with issues that concern me, and I wrote to them, all 5 in one go. It took me a few hours, to go through the website, and then I wrote to 5 people. And the only thing that was unusual is because I heard of the fellowship last-minute deadline thing. To all of them, I said, look, I'm a colleague, we are in the same business, there is a deadline. Could you please, if you approve, could you please answer rapidly? That's all. And everyone got the same email. Everyone got the same email. Of those 6. Of those 6, 1 didn't respond, 4 were generous, and immediately. And none of them heard of me or knew me. Just I hadn't heard of them and knew them. It happens. Four of them immediately said, sure, with questions, what do you want, da, 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 da. And this guy wrote, who I never heard of, wrote whatever he did, and then immediately, I tell the truth, I didn't know the BDS wasn't an issue in my life. I didn't know about Lynch. He isn't a significant person in Israel, never heard of him. And he wrote me an email, a personal one. So I answered him a personal email, and I went off with my life. The next thing, I wake up in the morning on this time difference. This was happening in the middle of the night. I wake up in the morning, somebody from Australia, a wonderful woman who I hadn't heard of before. I won't mention her name, not to embarrass her, she's here. She writes to me, and she says, I'm shocked to hear that the head of this institute has subjected you to BDS. She's also a faculty member. I'll sponsor you if you need. Which means that he took our personal exchange and sent it to the world in order to show that he can boycott a Jewish-Israeli scholar on exchange fellowship. That's the only thing with Lynch. I never heard of the man, and then I forgot about it again. And then the following week, I get a telephone from Australia saying, what's the story with the BDS? I had no idea that this is going to happen. I'm simply, in this respect, a scholar who I've been to so many places. This has never happened to me before. Exactly same protocol. When you go to places you don't know. So you have to contact people you don't know. That's how it works, right?
I'm gonna move on so we can have some more questions in the front row down here.
We all have a really we all have our own version of what multiculturalism is and isn't. But part of the culture, especially Jewish culture, is the law. Where does the law of these different cultures come when it comes to an Australian context?
Okay, I suppose.
Could you repeat?
Repeat the question. The question was in terms of you have multiculturalism, and then you have the law. I mean, how do different communities deal with the question of law and multiculturalism? In terms of the Jewish community, I think generally speaking, we have the principle of malchut adina, that the din of malchut adina, that the law of the kingdom is law, and that needs to be respected. In terms of my experience with the Muslim community, and I interact with not a few hundred people. They also see their friends on Facebook, so see different comments. I think the people that want Sharia for Australia are a group of, I mean, maybe some people fantasize about it, but people who actually advocate for that, I think are generally nuts. I was actually at a debate in Parramatta's town hall where there was a bunch of fanatics screaming Allah Akbar, and there was a guy who's mentally unhinged, who self-styled religious leader, who's an architect, I don't know if a good one or a bad one, but he's an architect, went to Indonesia, went to some village, came back with a long white robe, and declared himself some kind of religious leader. My context in the Muslim community don't have, they're barely embarrassed by it because he's so fringe. I can't speak for everyone. There are thousands and thousands of people. I can only talk about my own experience. It's a marginal issue.
Sorry, we're going to have to keep moving on. There's a gentleman over here.
The Minister for Justice, Tzipy has instigated an inquiry into defining the State of Israel as Jewish and democratic. And I'm wondering whether that aids the civil discourse that you're encouraging or will lead to more fracturing.
What was the beginning of your statement?
Tzipy Livni.
Tzipy, yeah. Tzipy Livni, yeah.
Has commenced an inquiry into a constitutional reform in Israel.
Yes.
To define Israel as Jewish and democratic.
Okay.
And will that generate a debate that encourages the civil discourse that you're talking about, or more fracturing?
Well, Israel was defined in 1992 in basic laws that are part of our constitutional process as a Jewish and democratic state. It was only then defined so. And it was not defined what that means. So that has been an ongoing debate since 1992. What is going on now is not that. What is going on now is that the government has put on the table of our parliament a basic law, which is part of the evolving constitution, which defines Israel as a Jewish state, and like in the 1947 resolution that established the state of Israel as a Jewish state. All right? Israel is, remember, partition? There's a Jewish state and an Arab state. It's so simple. It's so simple. So the government of Israel, because of all sorts of reasons, it has to do with the ongoing negotiation with the Palestinians, because hopefully it will end up with two states. So this will be a Jewish state, that will be an Arab-Palestinian state. You know, end of that. In Israel, it does generate debate because of precisely what I opened with this evening, because it's in here. It's just like the others in my mind, then my fears are in my mind. And when they're gonna, I'm not saying who the they is, I'm speaking not for myself. If I'm secular, say, well, they're going to call it a Jewish state, which means they're going to make it Orthodox. And if I'm nationalist, and each one of us, if I'm Arab, of course, what do they mean when they say? There's a lot of anxiety there. So there is a lot of anxiety around that, but the commission that's doing it is doing a very thorough work, and is actually is turning to Jewish communities all over the world to ask them what they think a Jewish state is. And I think it's a good dialogue going on within the Jewish people, not only within Israel. In Israel, it generates high emotions because of all sorts of fears about future interpretation.
We're just in the middle here in the red bucket.
Rabbi Kastel, I wanted to talk to you, get your view on religion in schools, scripture class. So there are a huge number of children in this state, in public schools, who waste 30 to 40 minutes a week because either they don't practice any religion or their religion doesn't get offered isn't offered in their class. So primary ethics has done a really good job, in my view, of filling that void. I'm just wondering if your organisation can also help fill that void and if you've considered doing that.
We don't want to. Firstly, we have been approached. Sorry, the question was about students who are not attending scripture classes are wasting their time at school, 30, 40 minutes a week, because when the children are in scripture, by law, the other children are not supposed to do anything else, so the children in scripture will miss out. So what primary ethics has done is they've offered ethics classes for children who are not religious. We've had some approach from primary ethics at one stage. It didn't really go anywhere. I mean, we certainly would be happy to help in one form or another. Our primary objective, though, is to reach all the kids. I wouldn't want to, if I could help it, I would prefer to actually reach the kids who aren't going in those religion classes and being taught perhaps that their way is the only way to heaven, and they kind of need us more.
Yeah. The question down here in the front row.
Thank you. Professor, when you talk about the other, I'm sure a lot of us, certainly I, was very confronted when I arrived here today to find some of the other outside the gate who happen to be our own kind, not even the other. They're Jews too. And I was so confronted I couldn't actually say anything to them or take it on, take them on, even though I wasn't happy that they were there. So what's your advice to, or sorry, what kind of help could you give people like me or any of the others here who felt the same way in our thinking about the other when it happens like this, right in our face, when we come to an event like this and they're right there?
Be good to hear from both of our panellists on this. Did we hear the question? Because the question was that this lady was just saying that this evening when she came to this event tonight, to talk about these ideas of overcoming adversaries, that she was confronted by the people who were handing out flyers at the front, and that she was confronted by the idea that they are some of the others within. They are the people within our own community who we don't share values with. And her question is, what advice can the panellists give when you find yourself in that situation, when you're confronted in that way? What can you do?
Well, context matters. Context matters. And context is prior to principle. Context matters. In that respect, first is the context, then there may be a principle. So I don't have a principle, I have a context. What's the context? This is an event organized as it has been organized. I show up like you, and someone's demonstrating outside. At that point, I'm not an educator. I'm complex, I'm plural, just like the pluricultural. I'm at this point, my personal inclination, it's a waste of time to enter an argument, and I personally am not running for office. I don't have any, how do you say, in short, I don't have any need to create a commotion and be at its center. So I personally come to do what I intended to do, and here I am doing it. Had I been on a different mindset, let's say I've had enough of this misguided stuff, I would try to create conditions where after all of this is over, okay, now you're right, I did it a lot with Palestinian nationalists, extreme ones in our program. When we open the program, and then I'll end this answer, at the Hebrew University, we want to use, we outreached in Arabic to get Arab students into our program. Yes, it's against the grain, the Hebrew University. It's against the grain in Israel. We wanted more Arabs in our department. And then they were, I remember them, doesn't matter the names, running in each class. Who are you? I'm this, and I'm a Palestinian Israeli. Because they know how Jewish Israelis don't respond well to that. And they were challenging us. And I understood that. And it's all right, challenge us. So after time, that goes away. And then we start talking about the real issues. What's hurting? Where's the pain? Can we solve it? Can we maintain a distance that is bearable? Can we come closer? It takes 2 years. That's a process. Someone, if he's or she's in your community, and you know that she's an honest person and you think that she's misguided, enter a dialogue with her, but a dialogue is a process. I personally don't enter shouting competitions on these things, because I'm not on a political agenda. If I wanted to run a party against them, then I would be there on a soapbox doing the stuff.
Yeah, completely agree. I don't think much is achieved by winning arguments and debating with people that are in that mode of pushing a point of view. They're not receptive. But I also think this, not necessarily with this particular case of people standing outside the door, but I think just more broadly in terms of people we disagree with. During the war in Gaza, interfaith in Sydney, certainly in terms of Muslim-Jewish interfaith, went into meltdown. There were relationships that had been established over many years, and suddenly it wasn't happening anymore. There were international connections that perhaps behind that as well, from Turkey and Fethullah Gulen and whatever else, won't get into that. But I went down to Lakemba and talked to one of the people I worked with while this whole thing was very, very hot. And he was saying he's under tremendous pressure. People who know that he's working with me, this Muslim guy, Arabic guy, they're saying to him, how can you talk to Jews? Has Zalman condemned Israel? He's not sincere. He's so and so and so forth. And what this guy needed to understand was that Jewish people are as convinced about Israel's case as a lot of people on the other side are convinced of their side of the story. So it's about recognizing sincerity even when we disagree. And that was important in that particular case. It's not necessarily agreeing. We can vehemently disagree with each other, but still seeing that there's a human being behind that opinion who happens to have an opinion you disagree with. It's not a monster. The person is not their opinion. There's the opinion that is the person. And sometimes that person is very well-meaning. Just one more example is we had a person working for us, an atheist, very, very left-wing, but a very beautiful person. I mean, and she, not that, forget that. She is a beautiful person, just a very, very compassionate, very into fair trade and all that sort of stuff. Not misguided. I didn't say that. I completely agree with her on fair trade. And during the one election, when Pauline Hanson was going very strong in Queensland, she was giving out flyers for the Greens, as she would. But she actually was open-minded enough to actually walk up to some of the people from the Pauline Hanson party, and One Nation party, and actually have a conversation just to understand. Open, not necessarily to agree, she completely vehemently disagrees with them, but why are they saying what they're saying? What's behind it? And she found that these were reasonable people with children and families who had their fears and concerns and came to certain conclusions. There's a very big difference, and I think it's extremely important that we recognize the difference between understanding and agreement.
Thank you.
I think on that note, I think that is the best question and best answers, I think, for us to end on. Our guests will be around a little bit longer this evening, but please join me in thanking tonight.
So we've had, I think, a wonderful journey tonight. Two very, I think, modest gentlemen, but really there are elements that are transformational and absolutely visionary about their work, and it's been a real privilege to hear from you tonight. Certainly to make us think about breaking down prejudices, breaking down assumptions, changing from within, from the ground up, and that this kind of work really needs to start with ourselves and this personal responsibility that we spoke about. And I think all of us are like the settler and the Palestinian nationalists on the bus. We're all on the bus, some kind of bus in our own lives, in our own country, and we kind of have to make it work because we can't actually get off the bus after 2 years because we're kind of stuck there forever. So thank you very much for your interesting discussion. Of course, thank you to Michaela for a wonderful facilitation. And of course, I'd like to draw your attention to the third flyer that's sitting on your chair tonight, and that is a full program that's offered by Encounters for this year, the Education Department at Shalom. We have a stellar lineup of educational and cultural events, Limud, the Sydney Jewish Writers Festival, Jewish Comedy Showcase, and some outstanding international scholars who will be here from Israel, including Yossi Klein Halevi, one of the Jewish world's most thoughtful and perceptive commentators, who will be here for the Irving Graf Memorial Oration in July, and also Dr. Yoaz Hendel, also from Israel in August, who's the head of a think tank, a former politico in Israel, a military historian, and someone who's really got a lot to say and is very highly esteemed in Israel. So please take this with you, please diarise the dates, and of course stay tuned to your email. I'd like to thank everyone again for participating tonight, to our guests, and of course to our co-presenters. Thank you.